my message to Afrikaners is, if you don't claim the right to self-determination, in 100 years you aren't going to exist. And I mean it, at the end of the day. And I say that ironically, I take endless abuse because of my Britishness. But I'm married to an Afrikaner.
I was going to say to you, the part I don't like about this is the fact that you're an Englishman saying it to me. My guest is a man who has faced accusations of racism and neo-colonialism, the leader of a movement, his critics say, which is designed to create a predominantly white, Western values-based independent state in the Western Cape, Cape Exit. To his supporters and many others in South Africa, he's viewed as a dedicated fighter committed to the Western Cape's future, perhaps even a visionary who seemed to suggest that South Africa might simply be too big and too diverse to be governed by a central government, and that some form of devolution of power, decentralization, will be, by definition, the future of South Africa. Welcome to my program, Phil Craig.
Thank you very much, Johan. It's great to be with you. Thank you for the invite.
Phil, I'd like to talk to you about, obviously, Cape Exit. I'd like to talk about your own journey. But first, Cape Exit. Let's start in the presence. You kicked off, if I have it correct, around about 2007, the movement. A lot of excitement around it. A lot of news. I followed some of the news here in Europe as well. But of late, I've not heard much about Cape Exit. So I guess my very first question is Cape Exit dead?
Yeah, no, look, absolutely not. It's a movement that's evolved and matured, and I think it probably is now part of the South African discourse. But we're past the sort of the initial excitement stage, so we say. And you're quite right. The movement started in 2007 when the Cape Party first sort of officially floated the idea. I got involved in 2020 myself, so you can see it was 13 years before I got involved. And I think often these we've seen in Brexit and other movements, you kind of have different iterations as an idea sort of moves from the sort of fringes into the mainstream. And there are times where it's in the ascendancy, and there are times where things go a little bit quiet due to the sort of the broader political circumstances. But Cape independence is now very, very much a part of the South African political discourse. All of the major political parties discuss it on a relatively regular basis. I think domestically, at least, it's well understood as one political option, a radical one. I would argue a necessary one, but it's still very much alive.
We've been at it for some years. We said 2007 it started. I remember seeing the images. The images are very exciting. The ideas are very exciting. It is provocative. And I think, obviously, you clearly got the reaction of every single person in South Africa. It's a much talked about movement. As I said, the last couple of months or years, perhaps, I'm outside here in Europe taking a view from abroad. I might not be fully informed about as to what is happening. But after all these years, Cape Referendum Party did not perform very well in 2024. I think 0.1, 0.2% of the vote. With all of this excitement, that seems very disappointing.
Well, it is. So first of all, the Referendum Party was only formed in November 2023 and registered in February 2024. So we were only a few months old. But that's not to say that it wasn't a disappointing result. And it's one of the biggest challenges that we have. There's kind of a conundrum at the heart of Cape independence, which is the majority of Cape independence supporters, we know from polling, 70% vote for the DA. The majority of DA voters in the Western Cape support Cape independence, and clearly the Western Cape is a much better run province because it has a DA government in comparison with the ANC. So we have this difficulty that an awful lot of people support Cape independence because they want to have this better run thing, and obviously the DA is part of that. But the DA ultimately are opposing Cape independence. So you have this conundrum in that people, yeah, and every election the DA come out and say, look, vote for the DA, because if you don't vote for us, the ANC are coming back, and and that is a nut at this point in time that politically we are yet to crack. How do we get Cape Independent supporters to vote against the DA? It's not an easy situation. Effectively, we're standing on this single issue of Cape independence. We want people to vote for that, and we're trying to say to people, look, if you don't vote for Cape independence, you make it very, very difficult for us to deliver it. But the unfortunately the harsh realities is that the majority of Cape independence supporters vote for the DA because they want to live in the Western Cape, which they recognise is better governed under the DA than the ANC, and so that's something we have to deal with.
Yeah, but that's really quite a conflict of forces now that you're talking about. And I seem to recall somewhere at some point you guys approached John Steenhuisen and the DA of the idea of knocking on the door of Cyril Ramaphosa to get some kind of a referendum going, and that has not materialized in the meantime. It becomes all very confusing.
Yeah, it is, and of course, a lot of work is done behind the scenes. It meant very much like a lot of these political movements. It's an iceberg, and people see what happened on the tip. We worked very, very hard, because for exactly the reasons we've alluded to, there is this inherent link, whether they like it or not, between the DA and Cape independence. And with the Cape Independence Advocacy, a primary part of our focus was to try and to cajole, pressure, convince the DA that they should call a referendum and allow the people of the Western Cape to vote on this issue. And I personally agreed a referendum with John Steenhuisen. He did agree to call a referendum. Unfortunately, that was just before the 2021 elections, when the DA were doing. John Steenhuisen had recently come to power, that had that disappointing result in 2019 under Maimani. They were sort of quite uncertain. I think they had a relative fear of this nascent movement, which is really starting to find some traction at that point in time. And ultimately, that allowed us to get this referendum agreement. After the 2021 elections, the DA reneged on it. John Steenhuisen went back on his word, and they tabled a referendum bill in Parliament, which they then slow walked, and they did an awful lot of other things, which ultimately weren't in particularly good faith. And that's where we ended up. And ultimately, that led us to starting the Referendum Party, because what do we do? Go back and negotiate a second time with the person who broke the deal the first time. So, but yes, very for a couple of years we were really, really involved with the DA and other political parties on almost a weekly basis, and we explored every possible opportunity to sort of find a way of doing this by agreement. We haven't been successful. We weren't successful at that point in time, and now we've got to explore other avenues. Yeah.
One of the biggest obstacles in the way of Cape independence might just be the Democratic Alliance.
Well, I would say not might just be, absolutely is, and it's a conundrum. And I say it in all sincerity, but recognizing that it's nuanced and may seem odd. At this point in time, if you live in the Western Cape, I would suggest that the DA is a bigger threat to your future than the ANC. The ANC is a dead organisation that is a dead man walking. Ultimately, the majority of people in the Western Cape have never voted for the ANC. They've put all their faith in the DA, and for 20 years they've given them an outright majority in the Western Cape Parliament. And the DA have used that authority to further their political ends, as opposed to act in the best interests of the Western Cape people. And I, personally find that very, very frustrating. As somebody who traditionally, whose family would have been DA voters and who would be very sympathetic to many of the DA's policies, I didn't have this view at the start. But I've got to this point where ultimately, the DA are conflicted. They are obviously a national party, but they're also a provincial party, and they have a federal structure, a national party, and they have a provincial party, and those two parties should have different ends. When the Western Cape Parliament and the Western Cape voters elected the DA to run the Western Cape, they don't expect them to be putting national interests first, and that's exactly what has happened. And in 20 years in the Western Cape Provincial Parliament, I think the DA have passed something like 2 or 3 bills in 20 years with their outright majority, which is an absolute disgrace, and the consequences are going to be disastrous for the Western Cape in the long term if something doesn't change very soon.
Let's take the conversation in a different direction. You've just been to the United States of America, Washington. Tell me about that.
The notion of Cape independence is very, very well received. And so we made a lot of very, very good contacts. I think, broadly speaking, to different degrees, from people who were outright supporters to other people who were sympathetic to the idea, and all positions. I mean, nobody was opposed to it, but nobody was opposed to Cape independence that we spoke to. Although probably if I'd gone and knocked on Joe Biden's door, or whoever else, it might have been a different story. But you also have to recognise that, and particularly currently in the US, yes, South Africa takes up a very small portion of the US's international bandwidth. So the message really that I brought back from the US is, international support is a critical component of secession. You need to have international communities, and particularly big countries, and the US being the biggest, to support you. I came back. With absolutely no doubt whatsoever that if we can do our part of the bargain, that the US would recognise an independent Western Cape, and happily so. But equally, they're not going to do it for us. We've got to do our part, and I think that was the message that I brought back to the movement here, and in many ways that sort of helped in this unification project, which is, guys, now's our time. This is a government that's going to recognise.
You say now it's our time. Do you mean now it's our time because of Donald Trump or because of the USA?
No, look, I think at this point in time, the Western world is busy realigning. It's moving away from predominantly left-leaning governments towards right-leaning governments, and I think it's clear, given our agenda in South Africa, that we're far more likely to get a sympathetic hearing from the likes of Trump and Farage and some of the European leaders. Than we would from Biden and whoever else is going to be in the chair in Europe. So yes, look, we have people who come from all political persuasions, so I wouldn't want to align us specifically with any particular candidate, but yes, a Republican presidency is much better for us than a Democratic one in the context of international recognition.
This is a struggle, obviously. It is a movement in the truest sense of the word. Have you got any historic examples that you could use as kind of references or inspirations, if you wish, that drives your thinking? And if I say your thinking, I mean the thinking of the various sectors within the movement.
Yeah, look. So the fascinating thing is secessions occur far more regularly than people actually realise. They often say, "When does it ever happen?" And you go say, "Well, look, go and count. There was 100 countries, 100 years ago. There's 200 countries now. Where do you think they come from?" And I think there's been something like 75 independence referendums around the world in the last 50 years. So and you can learn something from all of those. But obviously, there are some of them that are decolonisation. There are some of them where it's civil war. There are some of them where it was the collapse of a broader country or system, Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union. So I think you can, and certainly when it comes to the collapse of these big multi-ethnic countries like the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia, you can see some leanings from there. But the ones that I choose to look at are the ones where independence was contested in a constitutional democracy, where it was peaceful, where it was democratic, where there was a referendum. And I think at this point in time, they're the ones that are closest. And of course, it doesn't really matter whether they were successful or not successful. What matters is how did those play out, and what are the parallels, and what can you learn? So what would be the ones that I would look at, and the key ones for us, particularly from a legal perspective, So Quebec is highly significant because of the judgment of the Canadian Supreme Court in how international law interplayed with the or intersected with the Canadian Constitution. Then that was ironically affirmed by the UK Supreme Court in its judgment over Scotland. And Scotland gives us a very good example. People forget that Scotland didn't even have a parliament in 1990. It went from devolution in 1990, two further rounds of devolved powers, and then an independence referendum. Catalonia to a lesser extent. So there would be those three, and then Brexit, which whilst it wasn't a secession, that whole process of what happens after a referendum. How does it play out? How do the negotiations play out? What forces people to act in good faith? So probably they would be and personally, what would I look at most? Scotland, Quebec, and Brexit would be the three. And well, let's include Catalonia, but perhaps for different reasons. Many ways what not to do.
If you use the term "now is the time," I think in reference to your visit to the United States of America, but if you look at South Africa, 30 years post-apartheid. I would say the view from abroad here is that the dreams of the Rainbow Nation seems pretty shattered at this point, internationally accepted that it is so. And people here in Europe who used to be very reluctant to say these things are now sort of saying it quite openly. It's a mess in South Africa, which brings us to obviously the voices that you begin to hear. They might have been there all the way along, of people like Lex Libertas's Aaron's Roots, some people more in the conservative spectrum of South African politics were beginning to say things like South Africa is nothing but an illusion, South Africa is nothing but an artificial construct, etc., etc. Yeah. The big question from a European perspective is really, has the multicultural, multiracial, democratic ideals of South Africa, has that collapsed? Is that a failure? And is this in fact now the right time to think about alternatives? And I know that Adams talks about devolution of power or more autonomy to regions, etc., etc. They talk about the canton system or this system or that federalization, etc., etc. How do you view the momentum, and how could you use the moment that we find ourselves in?
No, look, there's definitely momentum, and this will be something that we've very definitely played our part. What some of the things that we've done in the CIG may feel like very insignificant things to the outside world, but are actually hugely significant. So, for example, one of the things that we consciously did is we set about normalizing the use of the word self-determination. And that very much is a word that's coming back. And you'll know from your history, it was associated with the Blanche. It was, people didn't want to use the word. If you looked at the likes of AfriForum, they'd never talk about self-beskikking. They'd talk about self-doen the other day because they all wanted to avoid this word. When I first mentioned the word self-determination to the DA, Helen Ziller nearly choked. What else can we call it? And I'd say, well, we can't call it anything else because it's a legal principle that's fundamental to international law. There's nothing wrong with the word self-determination. There's just wrong with how it's been interpreted in the past. So let's not throw out the baby with the bathwater. And we started to write regularly about self-determination, and it's a word that has re-entered South African politics for the good. And ironically, the one organisation that never stopped using it was the ANC. They just used it for South Sudan, Western Sahara, Palestine. They just never considered that their own people were entitled to self-determination too. But when it comes to the breakdown of South Africa, I think we have to distinguish the South African people from the South African state. My experience, and I think the experience of most people, is that South African people are absolutely magnificent. And if there is no politics and no political parties, everything gets along just fine. I live in a little rural town called Wellington. We're in the Platteland. Here, we like many people in the Cape, we've effectively got our three ethnic groups: white South Africans, coloured South Africans and black South Africans, and we here the whites all speak Afrikaans, the coloured people speak Afrikaans too, the black people speak Xhosa, and we all get along absolutely fine. Yeah, there isn't the problem isn't us. We'll work fine. The problem is the system of government, and the problem with South Africa is it is a colonial construct. It was created, obviously, in 1910. It's got a unitary state, which effectively means whoever holds power in Pretoria dominates everybody else. And whoever's held power, whether it was the British colonial powers, whether it was Afrikaners during an apartheid era, or now whether it's the African nationalists, they've always abused somebody because, once you sit there without power, you're going to put yourself or your group or whatever else first. And that is the issue, that we've got this hugely diverse country, 11 official languages, 12 official languages now, huge geographical area, half the size of Western Europe, and suddenly one person sits in the middle. And that is the problem. And that's where self-determination, that's where decentralization becomes the solution. That simply says, so how does that ground itself in the Western Cape? Well, it grounds itself in the Western Cape that the majority of Western Cape voters have never, ever once been governed by the government they voted for. That's not democracy after 30 years, and there's no prospect of it happening in the foreseeable future either. They're trapped. They're trapped being governed by a terrible government that they didn't vote for. They didn't vote it in. They can't vote it out. They're discriminated against it, or the majority of us are discriminated against it on the basis of our race. We have chronic unemployment, chronic crime. We want control of our police. We can't get it. We've got terrible economic policies. So we're trapped. And we're trapped under a unitary state because people in the rest of South Africa want this government, even though we don't. And that's where Cape independence is a solution. And that forms part of a bigger picture. It's not just about the people of the Western Cape. Cape independence clearly is. But we support, and particularly the Referendum Party, all forms of self-determination, actually, and there's the movement for Cape independence, there's the movement for Afrikaner self-determination, there's a big Zulu self-determination movement, and then you've got smaller ones, the Venda, the Basotho, and so on. And ultimately, people want to be governed in their own communities. And I think we remain relatively flexible about how that gets done. What we know is the current system of government is an absolute disaster. It cannot last, and we need to find an alternative. And in the Western Cape, Cape independence is the most logical way to go, given that we do have a political majority of people who are favouring at this point in time a different form of government policy-wise.
I think you used the word trapped by the unitary state. I think if I'm correct now. My question is: are you trapped by the unitary state? It's a very important question, I think. Or are you trapped by a bad government? Are you trapped by an incompetent, corrupt government? Or are you trapped by exactly that broader question of the unitary state? And then in reference to the national dialogue, which I think is still running or will be running for the next couple of months and so on, why would that which we are pointing out now, putting the focus on now, the trap of the unitary state, why would that not be, for me, a fundamental, almost a point of departure in terms of the national dialogue that we should be having in South Africa?
No. So, look, first of all, absolutely. Look, we have got a terrible government, but the terrible government is a symptom and not the cause. And let's be honest. If we were sitting here and it was, we were back in the 70s and it was the apartheid government, it might have been better for you and I, but it would have been an awful lot worse for the majority of people in South Africa. And likewise under the British. So ultimately it's the system that's wrong because it always forces that the majority of people in South Africa are going to be losers. So it doesn't matter who's the government. The ANC are a terrible government, are a great way of proving why it's wrong. But ultimately, ultimately we're not going to end up with some successful, benign national majority that suddenly is going to create utopia across all of South Africa's diverse communities. Never happened in its entire history. It's never going to happen. And I think it'll be a brave person to suggest otherwise. The problem when you come to the national dialogue, of course, is that the African nationalists dominate South Africa. So, and one of the unintended consequences of the apartheid era is that we created this identity of Black African. Um, there was no such thing as a black African before the Europeans invented it. There were Xhosas and Zulus and Vendas, and actually, South Africa would be a country if I would say if we took affirmative action or BE and we applied it on the basis of language as opposed to skin color, nobody would favour it. If you went to the Zulus and said, "Hey guys, the Xhosas make up 20% of the population, so 20% of all jobs in KZN must go to Xhosas," they would have absolute kittens. But actually, if you create this identity of black, and then it allows the Zulus to control themselves in the Western Cape, the Xhosas to control themselves in the Eastern Cape, and basically then the coloured Indian and white minorities to get trampled on by everybody else. And so this is an issue. And then when we feed into the national dialogue, this identity is a very, very comfortable identity for that majority, because that majority now basically make up 80% of the population, and a unitary state just works out fine because they can pass whatever policies they want in their own favour. And one of the illusions is in 1994, 63% of South Africans voted the ANC. We say we've made lots of progress. Well, in 2024, 64% of South Africans voted ANC or for one of their two breakaway parties, MK or the EFF. And ultimately, you've got 2/3 of South Africans voting for African nationalism. And whilst we've got a unitary state, that works out very, very well for that majority. They're not going. They want a centralised state because they want complete power, and they're not going to voluntarily hand it over to anybody else. That's why this right to self-determination is so important, because the right to self-determination is an undeniable right in international law, and it's a right that minority communities, including the Western Cape people, but also Afrikaners and other cultural communities, can assert by right and say, we want to govern ourselves in South Africa, internally, externally. That all can be debated, but we have a right to govern ourselves, and we must assert it. And I passionately believe that for all of these groups who are losing under the current system.
I understand what you say, and I have a certain amount of, I'm not quite sure what the right word would be. Empathy is not the right word. It's the only word I can come up with right now. I understand. I get it. I fully comprehend it inside my body, what you're talking about. However, I also know it puts me and what you just said now, you for that matter, and people that say these things into the box of the so-called new colonial thinkers. And it does put people like you, and perhaps I can include myself and my private self in that as well, then on what appears to me might be the fringes. And I guess the question is this beginning to become part of the discussion today, or is this still fringe thinking?
So let's look at for example, DA policy. The DA, in theory, support federalism, although we tried to work with them to deliver federalism, and they didn't seem to support it very much at that point, but are actively pushing for devolved powers, which is a form of self-determination. So I think we've got this situation where we're right at the edge of the Overton window, and we're trying to push that open. So I think the ideas behind this are absolutely understood. There are plenty of parties who favour self-determination. In the Western Cape Parliament, about 60-odd%. Would they then call it self-determination? If you said, as I said to you, when I tried to suggest to the DA that they should push self-determination, they had kittens. But when I spoke to a professor of law, they said, well, the DA's policies are self-determination. So I think you've kind of, and we're in this situation where people are very, very sensitive of what they say. Obviously, there's been an awful lot of, the story of the last 20 or 30 years is name calling and trying to silence people down. So you're going to have all sorts. You're going to have people like me, and where you think where I think, call me what you like, say what you like, I don't really care. Ultimately, I'm going to stand up for what I believe is right, and I know my heart, and I would say, I'll answer to my conscience and to God, and the rest of you could go get stuffed. I'm going to do what I believe is right. But not everybody's made that way, and some people are much more careful about what they say and much more affected by name calling, and they're obviously a bit more cautious. But I think in general, the Overton window has been radically moved, and the best way to illustrate that is in 2020 when we really got started. Federalism was an extreme position. It was unthinkable that you could talk about federalism. Yeah, that was a very radical position. All of a sudden, federalism has become the compromise position. Actually, we're the radicalists but suddenly federalism is perfectly okay, and increasingly you're starting to find people who perhaps don't come from the political right and don't come from ethnic minorities, also starting to say, well, actually, you know what? Federalism wouldn't be a bad idea. You can't have Cape independence. We don't want you to have Cape independence, but actually, why wouldn't federalism work? And I think we just have to sort of look at this more holistic view of it all, and so yeah, the answer to your question is I think it absolutely is in the mainstream, but we're constantly pushing that edge and trying to open up more and more space for this discussion to take place, and obviously the collapsing state at the other end helps create the need.
I guess the question that's foremost on my mind at this point is one that I've asked in various ways to various actors and various people on the entire political spectrum. In a sense, we're talking about unscrambling the egg in South Africa, I guess. And that seems to be the toughest one to undo, in practical terms.
Yeah, and I think that relies upon people to be realistic. And in many ways, this is where we're often misunderstood. So if somebody thinks, hang on a second, you're going to create the Western Cape, and somehow you're going to create some sort of ethnic purity and roll back history to some point in the past, be it 94 or 1910, or is nonsensical. We are where we are. Everybody's here where they're here. The solution is finding ways that apply to us now in our current circumstances, and in which everybody wins. A win-lose is never a good negotiation. This absolutely has to end up in a situation where everybody wins. And I think to a certain extent, even if we get Cape independence, or I hope when we get Cape independence, even that state needs to be decentralized. We need to recognize that there are, very distinct cultural and linguistic communities that make up the Western Cape, who all need to have their place in the sun and all need to win out of this arrangement. And ultimately, the success of any emergent country isn't going to be the who voted for it. Ultimately, very, very quickly, you need to find the people that voted against it to realize, well, gosh, I really didn't think this was going to be a good idea, but boy, am I glad it happened. That's where you really start to get success. And you have to make sure that after the fact, that everybody wins. And that comes down to not creating a small version of South Africa in the Western Cape, but recognizing that this dominant centralized structure where the largest group dictate terms to everybody else is never going to work. And there's plenty of examples where that plays out. I mean, Switzerland, obviously, people talk a lot about because of the canton system, but Belgium is a system where I'm also fascinated in, where they have this linguistic level of government. So now if you're living in French-speaking territory in Belgium, but you're Flemish, then the French local government doesn't control your cultural institutions and your schools. It's controlled by the Flemish Language Council, and so I think we'll need to have our own system for the Western Cape that's kind of unique to our circumstances. But there's lots to learn from other countries around the world who deal with this diversity, linguistic and cultural diversity, far better than we do in South Africa. And the solution is never to have a winner-takes-all solution.
Yeah. I noted the other day in a discussion, somebody mentioned to me that in the process of decolonization, in the foundational papers of the African Union, the one thing they don't touch on are borders in Africa, specifically. And I guess in that lies the warning of all the stuff that you and I are talking about right now, because once you start that process, it has no end, really, and it causes ginormous amount of friction and conflict. So I guess the question at the end of the day is really the feasibility. Is it practical? Is it possible? Is there a way out of the other than the situation that we find ourselves in South Africa?
Oh, look, this is 100%. This is a
Is
very
it
look.
doable? Is in other words, so that's really what I'm asking.
Yeah.
Is it doable?
It's absolutely doable. All that's missing is the political will. South Africa has an unusual legal framework that actually is highly beneficial to this. Self-determination is a law that's strengthened and strengthened and strengthened in international law to the point where now it's an undeniable peremptory norm that countries must abide by. The Western Cape. The fascinating of the Western Cape is a construct of modern South Africa. It didn't exist until 1994, but the Constitution created a border, it created a people, it created a voters' roll, it created a parliament, it created a Western Cape government, and that people and all of those institutions that have been created to represent them are the means by which those people can assert their right to self-determination. The Western Cape. There are only two provinces in South Africa that pay into the economic system, Gauteng and the Western Cape. Here you have a system that absolutely, it's really simple would be unfair to say, but in relative terms, for other secessions, Western Cape independence is relatively simple if the political will exists. If the DA supported Cape independence, we'd already be independent. That's the bottom line.
The legal framework, I noted here that you use in the South African context. I understand the international law argument, sure, but the South African argument is Article 235, which seems to be something that even if you talk to the leaders of the Freedom Front Plus, and I've spoken to a number of them through the last few years and so on, seems to be a ball that they just don't seem to know what to do with. That's one of my questions. Part of my question. The other part of it: how do you apply 235, which essentially is defined in terms of a cultural union? How do you apply it to the Western Cape? So, two questions.
So, look, the lack of action on Section 235 is one of my biggest frustrations. I had the privilege of speaking at the AfriForum conference last year, and that was the subject. My message to Afrikaners is: if you don't claim the right to self-determination, in 100 years you aren't going to exist. And I mean it, at the end of the day. And I say that ironically, I take endless abuse because of my Britishness. But I'm married to an
Afrikaner. I was going to say to you, the part I don't like about this is the fact that you're an Englishman saying it to me. That's the only part that I kind of emotionally rebel against.
No, I understand all too well. But I live in an Afrikaans town. I'm married to an Afrikaner, and my own children are Afrikaans speaking, not English speaking. So I in many ways, I've assimilated into Afrikaans culture, and I'm passionate about the Afrikaans people, and I desperately want them to assert their right to self-determination. And it frustrates me beyond all measure how they've been abused, for 3 decades. I recognise it in the past that they were the abusers, but they're the abused now, and they've got this right now. And we can get onto Section 235 in the context of the Western Cape in a minute. But Section 235 was written by Afrikaners for Afrikaners. It's there. Just claim the bloody thing. For me, it's incredibly frustrating when we see the issues with the Bella Bill and and Afrikaans people being stripped intentionally of their economic rights, of their cultural rights, of their linguistic and educational rights, and not claiming Section 235. I don't get it. And privately, I'm involved in some projects because I want to make that happen at the end of the day. But that's outside of my let's call it my professional capacity for Cape independence. Now, the second question, so that's in terms of Afrikaners. When it comes to Section 235, I was always of the view. So first of all, the South African legal construct is fascinating because the South African Constitution, like many constitutions, effectively says international law is subject to the South African Constitution, except international law can't be subject to the South African Constitution. And it's easy to get that because you just go and ask any lawyer. Says, well, okay, so what are you suggesting? That international law doesn't apply to South Africa? And of course, well, I'm not saying that, but actually, international law and constitutional law are parallel to each other. South African Constitution has done everything it can in many ways to accommodate international law within its structures, but the right of self-determination, whether it's written in the South African constitution or not, is a peremptory norm, a just Kogan's right of international. It cannot be denied. It doesn't matter whether South Africa puts in its constitution or not. It exists and it applies to South Africa. And other countries, more than that, have an erga omnes obligation. In other words, other countries outside of South Africa, if South Africa doesn't honour the right of self-determination, have the right and in fact the obligation to interfere in South Africa's internal affairs to make sure that South Africa respects the right to self-determination. So self-determination is an extraordinary, powerful right, and it exists whether it's in whether 235 was written or it wasn't written. South Africa can't opt out of the right of self-determination. But actually, as you say, the wording of Section 235 is relatively, it talks about cultural and linguistic communities. There's an argument of is the Western Cape a cultural and linguistic community, and I perhaps always erred on the side of caution and believed that it wasn't. Perhaps didn't apply to the Western Cape, but didn't particularly matter either. One of the law professors who actually sat on the ad hoc committee of Parliament, which wrote Section 235, managed to convince me the otherwise. And he sat down and he said, Phil, I promise you, Section 235 absolutely applies to the Western Cape and Cape Independence. It's quite intentionally got an open-ended formulation in that it doesn't specify exactly how self-determination must be applied, and you can apply that for the Western Cape. So I'm happy to hear that, but whether it's in or it's out is irrelevant. The people of the Western Cape have an undeniable, what does the African Charter say? Inalienable and unquestionable right to self-determination, and that exists. And look, clearly, when you get to the business end of that, there are going to be some challenges. I mean, having a law on a piece of paper and actually turning that into the reality of the ground is different. And ultimately, the reality on the ground is the one that's going to determine what happens with most secessions. In the Western Cape, obviously, as I say, we have a provincial government. We have a provincial parliament. Western Cape people exist, and clearly they are the people on the ground in the Western Cape. If the Western Cape government decides that it's going to exercise its right to self-determination, there's not much that the national government can do. Albeit that the process is supposed to be, should be, and will be, I hope, a negotiated settlement.
I want to talk about just your own journey for a short while. You came to South Africa in, am I right, 2005 or something like that?
Yeah, late 2004, early 2005. Yeah.
Yes, just two short questions. What lured you to South Africa? What took you to South Africa? And as you arrived in South Africa, you found yourself, of course, in this new Rainbow Nation, Desmond Tutu's Rainbow Nation, I remember. So I'd like to know what took you to South Africa in the first place? What was the motivation? And secondly, when you arrived there, did you buy into this wonderful new Rainbow Nation that we were told we had created in 1994?
Yeah, interesting. So how did I come here? Look, there are lots of reasons. Rugby features very heavily in them. I played rugby my whole life. I was right at the end of my playing career. I had a business that I was running in the UK that had got bigger than I wanted to be. I wanted out. I kind of wanted to do something different. My partner at the time wanted to go overseas, and I said, okay, fresh start. Let's go do something completely different. But I want to go somewhere where I can play rugby. And at that point, our only language was English, and we must speak where I can go and speak English. So it was Australia, New Zealand, or South Africa, I had, for various reasons, I had a positive association with South Africa from people that I knew who'd been here, I jumped on the plane. I came down here. I played a couple of games of rugby for Paarl. I found a very nice pub. They played live music. I loved it, and I sat in the vineyards in Wellington, thinking, well, we've got rugby, we've got pubs, we've got live music, we've got good weather. This is paradise, and I came, and I've never looked back, and it's been a fantastic choice. the South Africa that I came to, I probably came in the golden years. Then I remember I got 10 rand for every pound that I brought. There's no,
I
yeah,
just, I just, uh, I just
yeah,
saw now, 2005, 2006, that was the Mbeki years. I think we had an economic growth of what, 4, 5, 6% or something like that. A lot of
yeah.
optimism in the country.
Yeah. But exactly, I came that, and yeah, I think now we're at 24 to the panic. So I came in the good times. At that point, it was South Africa was pursuing sound economic policies. It was on the up. It was great. It was an exciting place to be on. And actually, in many ways, that's where the tragedy and the frustration that came. People say, "Why did you come to South Africa to lead the Cape Independence movement?" It's like, well, I didn't. Actually, Jacob Zuma got into power. Things went downhill very, very quickly. I married a South African. I had children, and suddenly their future depended on what ordinary citizens were going to do, what all these South Africans were going to do, and now I'm one of them, and I have an obligation. And ironically, my sort of eureka moment was in the Engia Church in Wellington, and I used to love he's retired now, but there's a Dominee Benny van Rensburg, and I always loved him because he always mix politics and religion, which they say you must never do. But for me, I want that. And he stood up and he said, there's no point in coming to church on a Sunday and praying that God's going to save South Africa if you're going to go home on Monday and do nothing about it. You know what you've been called to do. Now go and do it. For right or wrong, I said to my wife, because I was getting more and more frustrated as someone who's a political animal. I wanted stuff to change, but I felt I'm a Brit. It's not my job to do it. But why don't these people do something? And that day, I thought, well, okay, maybe it's not for these people to do something. Maybe it's for me to do something, and I did.
Yeah, you've been there for something like 20 years now. I know that when one goes on a short holiday in America, at the end of your holiday, you kind of feel American. You assimilate very quickly. Do you feel you felt assimilated very quickly by South Africa? Did you become South African in some ways or another? And then I suppose the last part of that question would be, what the hell's going on with your application for citizenship?
So, right, first question. I felt so when I came to South Africa, I within a year, I felt like I was suddenly a round peg in a round hole. Where in England, I'd always been a round peg in a square hole. For me, particularly this sort of rural South Africa, I always described it as having a frontier mentality. It's wild. It's wild compared to the thing, and I absolutely loved it, and I still love it. And there was a beautiful expression that somebody said, once you get African dust on your feet, you could never wash it off. Well, that's my experience, and I used to cut on the few. I didn't often go back, but I went back to the UK. I remember driving on the R44 into Wellington as I come over the hill, and as soon as I saw the sort of the Wellington Paarl Valley, I was home. And that was after 1 year. After 20 years, I've lived in Wellington more than I've lived anywhere else in my life. This is my home. It's in my soul. I absolutely love it. I'm not a South African citizen, and we can get on that question there. But in my heart, I'm as South African as they come. I haven't stopped being British. I'm absolutely proud. I love my country of birth. I'm proudly British, but I'm proudly South African too. And I love both parts of that. But South Africa's my home, and it's going to remain my home. For as long as it possibly can. I hope to live here, die here, be buried here, and we end up with we end up with South Africa fulfilling its true potential.
Yeah.
Citizenship is obviously, you may have picked up, they were busy in Parliament yesterday trying to debate how they could get me out of the country, which has been a sort of a popular refrain for a few years. And obviously, I'm not a popular figure with the ANC and EFF and MK. Winston Churchill said, "You've got enemies. Good. That means you stood up for something at some point in your life." And the more I piss off the ANC, the EF, and the MK, then more I know I'm doing the right thing. So let them do their whining. They tried to get a legal opinion that they could throw me out of the country. Unfortunately for them, and perhaps fortunately for me, that they came back and said that they couldn't. I'm doing absolutely nothing wrong. to their credit, the DA stood up and said, "Look, yeah, campaigning for Cape independence is not illegal, and yeah, this is a democracy, and this whole situation is crazy." So I thank the DA for doing that. I'm desperately trying to get citizenship. People don't realize just how screwed up Home Affairs is. I wanted to stand as a candidate in the 2024 elections, and I went to a lawyer about 18 months beforehand, and I started the process. I'm now 35,000 round down the line, two lawyers, and after 3 years, I'm still at the process of trying to get the Department of Home Affairs to prove that I'm a permanent resident, despite the fact that the president has announced it on national TV, and it's been debated in Parliament. But that system is just defunct. I will get there in the end. I've been married to my second wife. We've been married for 13 years. I've got 4 children who are South African by birth. Eventually I'll get citizenship because I qualify in multiple ways, but it's going to be a fight. And obviously, my political views will make it even harder, but we'll persevere, and in the end, we'll win.
Let me ask you a very silly little question. I've just met you. You look like the kind of guy that one would love to sit down and have a beer with and talk rugby to, etc., etc. But this whole South African citizenship thing, is it something that would give you something? And I'm not trying to get into your emotion or in your heart now, but is it something that is important to you? And let me qualify this a little bit. I've applied for Dutch citizenship. And I will never give up my South African citizenship, and I will never stop being an Afrikaner, which is I'm an Afrikaner, born and bred, and you cannot get it out of my system. But it is important to me, after so many years here in this country, to feel part of it. So citizenship is something meaningful at the end of the day, beyond just the technical. So does it mean something to you?
Look, it means absolutely. Yeah, it does. It means everything to me. And in funny ways, people will say, "Well, hey, what do you want to be a South African?" In fact, I think there was an article, somebody from the, probably from broadly our camp said, "Well, why the hell does Phil Craig want South African citizenship? Because he wants Cape independence." But at this point, the Western Cape is part of South Africa. This is my country. I want Cape independence because it's for the best interests of the people there. And obviously, if we get Cape independence, I'll become a citizen of the Cape as opposed to the rump state of South Africa. But I absolutely do. And people may not agree with my political views. Many people don't, and that's absolutely fine. I hope that they can respect that I've come here and I've fought for what I think is right, and I've done it peacefully and I've done it democratically, and I've absolutely given to this country which I love, and maybe it's a good way to close. I remember being at a function somewhere, and it's always I take, as I say, I take plenty of abuse, and an Afrikaner ironically stood up and said, why are you doing this? At the end of the day, you're a Brit. What's this got to you? Why are you doing this? And I smiled and I said to him, I agree with you. This absolutely shouldn't be me. Why am I doing it? Well, I'm doing it because you didn't, that's a refrain from here that lots of people, certainly this is not a journey I've walked alone. But I've done my pound of flesh, and I wish a lot of other people who should be more connected to this country would do as much as I've done.
I guess my last question, do you think that you will see something like Cape independence or a semblance of Cape independence during your lifetime?
Yes, I do.
You believe that?
Yeah, I do. Look, I think some form of it is inevitable. It's already happening. I mean, you in the last decade, 300,000 Afrikaners. So I'm quite close to the guys in Iran, for argument's sake, and they're fighting and fighting the good fight. In my opinion, it's not a place I would personally want to go and live, but I absolutely defend to the hilt their right to be there. And I spoke at their annual conference this year. And Iran has fought over 30 years, and it's got 3,000 people now living there, and what they've achieved is absolutely amazing. In the last decade, 300,000 Afrikaners have moved to the Western Cape. South Africa is breaking apart; it's collapsing, and as it collapses, other things are going to emerge, and some form of Cape independence is inevitable. Whether it's the formal, whether it's informal, I don't know. Already people say, look, frankly, the Western Cape is a different country, and to a certain extent, it already is. I think what we have to just do is keep on fighting to try and make sure that this becomes a win for everybody. And for years, France Cronje always talk about this enclave state and say, look, you don't need Cape independence because you're going to have these luxury estates, and actually the middle classes are going to pull into these societies, and actually they'll just do everything for themselves. And that may well be the case, but what a horrific outcome that would be in my mind. That I don't want to live in a society where we retreat into these little walled enclaves and screw everybody else. One of the most amazing things about the Western Cape is this cultural melting plot, which has been going on for 400 or 500 years, and the sort of the intersection of those cultures is just absolutely amazing. And I want everybody to win. So I don't want an enclave future. I want a functional part of this part of Southern Africa, the Southern African tip, where we can create a first world country where everybody wins, and we create a future where, I think we talked about earlier, where the diaspora want to come back. Where all that's good, and I think you mentioned at some point that term, Western-leaning people. I don't mean white. When I say Western-leaning, I don't mean white. I mean people who kind of want to live this first world future around Western values, which is who the majority of people in the Western Cape currently are. And that's what we want to create, this successful country that can be an example to Africa and a proof that Africa doesn't have to be a failure for everybody. People can absolutely succeed here.
Well, Craig, thank you very much for this discussion. Thanks so much.
You too.